"You call this a Thanksgiving meal?" my daughter-in-law said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the clatter of silverware. And in that moment, I realized this was never about the food. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the cinnamon pie I had woken up at 5 in the morning to bake. The same recipes I had carried through 40 years of family gatherings. The same ones my son used to beg for as a boy, standing on a chair beside me, flour on his cheeks and laughter in his eyes. But that night, none of it seemed to belong to me anymore. I sat at the head of the table, where I had always sat, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching as Ashley leaned back in her chair with a tight smile, her napkin untouched, her eyes scanning the dishes as if they were something beneath her, something unworthy of her approval. And when she spoke again, louder this time, the room seemed to shrink around her words. "I mean, honestly, Daniel, how do you even eat this?" My son let out a small laugh, the kind he used when he didn't want to choose a side, and that laugh landed heavier than anything else in the room, heavier than her words, heavier than the silence that followed, and I felt something inside me settle, not break, not shatter, but settle into a quiet understanding I had been avoiding for far too long. I reached for my glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down with steady hands, my reflection faintly visible on the polished surface of the table I had saved years to buy. The same table where birthdays were celebrated, where report cards were praised, where I had once believed love lived without question. No one spoke after that. Not my son, not Ashley, not even little Emma, who usually filled every silence with questions about school or stories about her friends. And in that stillness, I noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. The way Daniel avoided looking at me directly, the way Ashley's lips curved slightly as if she had just proven a point, the way the chair beside me, once my husband's, now felt colder than it had ever been. I dabbed the corner of my mouth with my napkin, though there was nothing there, just a habit, a gesture to occupy the space where a response might have been expected, and I smiled, not because anything was funny, but because I finally understood that reacting would only confirm the role they had quietly assigned me, the one I had been slipping into without realizing it. The meal continued, if it could be called that, plates half-touched, conversations forced, and I sat there, listening, observing, counting not the minutes but the small, undeniable signs that this moment was not sudden, not accidental, but the result of something that had been building for years, something I had chosen not to see until now. And as I looked around that table, at the faces that once felt like home, I realized with a calm I did not expect that this was the last time I would sit there as the woman they thought I was. The house stayed quiet long after the sound of their car disappeared, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but revealing, as if every corner of the room had been waiting for the truth to settle before showing itself. And I moved slowly through the space, turning off lights one by one, not out of routine, but with intention, noticing how different everything looked when it was no longer being prepared for someone else. The dining table still held the faint scent of the meal, plates stacked neatly, chairs slightly out of place, and I paused there, resting my hand on the back of Daniel's chair, remembering how he used to swing his legs under it when he was too small to reach the floor, how he would ask for seconds before he had even finished his first serving, his voice full of excitement that made even the simplest meals feel like celebrations. And I realized I could not remember the last time he had looked at me that way. I walked into the living room and sat down, not to rest but to think, really think, without interruption, without trying to excuse what I had seen, and one by one, moments began to surface, small at first, almost insignificant on their own, but together they formed something I could no longer ignore, like pieces of a puzzle I had been avoiding putting together. There was the birthday dinner last year when Ashley had suggested they celebrate at a restaurant instead of my house, saying it would be easier for everyone, and I had agreed, only to spend most of the evening listening to conversations I was not part of, smiling at jokes I did not understand, paying the bill at the end because it felt expected rather than appreciated. There was the time Daniel stopped calling on Sundays, replacing those long, easy conversations with quick messages that always seemed to come late in the evening, as if I had become something to check off rather than someone to connect with. And when I had asked if everything was all right, he had reassured me in that same distant tone that everything was fine, that they were just busy. And then there were the smaller things, the kind that are easy to dismiss if you want to believe the best in people. The way Ashley would correct me in front of others with a smile that felt more like a performance than kindness. The way decisions about holidays, about visits, about even the smallest traditions were made without asking me, as if my role had quietly shifted from being part of the family to being an optional presence. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape the memories, but to let them settle into something clear, something undeniable. And when I opened them again, I did not feel overwhelmed or angry, just certain that what happened that evening was not an isolated moment, not a misunderstanding, but the natural result of something that had been allowed to grow unchecked, something I had chosen not to confront because it was easier to keep the peace than to risk losing what I thought I still had. And now that I could see it for what it was, I understood that keeping the peace had only made it easier for them to decide I no longer belonged in it. I did not go upstairs right away that night, even though my body felt tired in the way it always did after hosting a full day of cooking and preparation, because something in me knew that if I walked into that bedroom too quickly, I would fall back into the same patterns that had kept me blind for so long. So instead I stayed in the living room, the soft lamp casting a warm glow over the furniture that I had chosen piece by piece over the years, each item tied to a memory, a decision, a moment when this house still felt like a shared dream rather than something I had quietly maintained alone. My eyes drifted to the framed photographs on the shelf, and I stood up to look at them more closely, picking up one of Daniel as a young boy, his arms wrapped around me, his smile wide and unguarded, the kind of smile that did not question love or measure it. And I held that frame a little longer than I expected, not out of longing, but out of clarity, because the boy in that picture had trusted me completely. And I had spent years believing that trust could never be replaced, never be redirected, never be influenced by someone else. And now I could see how slowly, how quietly, that assumption had been proven wrong. I set the frame back down carefully and moved to the next one, a family photo taken just a few years ago, all of us standing in the backyard, the same backyard I had spent weekends planting flowers in, trimming hedges, making sure it looked welcoming whenever they came over. And in that photo, Ashley stood slightly in front of Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile confident, almost practiced. And I remembered how proud I had been to welcome her into our family, how I had told friends that I had gained a daughter, not realizing that what I had truly gained was someone who understood exactly how to reposition herself at the center of everything. I sat back down slowly, my hands resting on my knees, and allowed the memories to continue, not stopping them, not softening them, just letting them come as they were. And there was a moment that returned to me with surprising clarity, a conversation from months ago when Ashley had suggested that Daniel and she might need more space, that the house felt too crowded during holidays, and I had laughed lightly at the time, thinking she meant scheduling, thinking she meant logistics, not realizing she meant something much more deliberate, something that would eventually lead to nights like this where I was present but no longer included. I leaned back and looked around the room one more time, taking in the quiet, the order, the life I had built with steady hands and quiet dedication, and I understood then that none of this had happened suddenly. None of it had been out of character for them. It had simply been easier for me to believe in the version of our family that I had created rather than the one that was unfolding right in front of me. And now that illusion had finally dissolved, not with anger or chaos, but with a simple, undeniable shift in how they spoke, how they looked at me, how they chose to treat what I had always given freely. And as I sat there in that stillness, I realized that the question was no longer why this had happened, but what I was willing to accept moving forward. The next morning arrived quietly, without announcement, the kind of morning that does not rush you but waits for you to decide what to do with it. And I woke before the sun had fully risen, lying still for a moment as I listened to the soft hum of the house around me, the familiar creaks and settling sounds that had once comforted me, and now felt like a reminder that everything in this space had remained steady while something else had shifted beyond recognition. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, grounding myself in the simple act of beginning the day, and instead of moving toward the kitchen out of habit, I paused, considering each step as if it mattered more than it had before, because in a way, it did. The coffee brewed in silence, the scent filling the air in a way that usually felt warm and inviting. But this time it felt different, not unpleasant, just neutral, as if even the smallest routines were waiting to see what I would choose to make of them now. I carried my mug to the dining table and sat in the same chair as the night before, but everything about it felt altered, not because the room had changed, but because I had stopped looking at it through the same lens, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a thought I had avoided for years, that this house, this life, this role I had built so carefully might no longer serve me in the way I had always believed it did. My gaze moved across the room, taking in the details I had once associated with pride and belonging, and instead of feeling attached, I felt observant, as if I were looking at a place I knew well but no longer needed to protect at all costs. And that realization did not bring sadness. It brought a quiet kind of freedom that settled deeper with every breath I took. I finished my coffee slowly, then stood and walked toward the hallway where I kept the small desk I used for paperwork, the drawer opening with a soft resistance that reminded me it had not been touched in some time, and inside were documents I had organized years ago, neatly labeled, carefully stored, because I had always believed in being prepared, even when I hoped I would never need to rely on that preparation. I pulled out a folder and set it on the desk, opening it with steady hands, scanning the pages not with urgency, but with focus, understanding that this was not about reacting to a single moment, but about responding to a pattern that had finally become clear enough to address. Names, dates, ownership details, everything laid out in plain language that did not shift or change depending on anyone's mood or opinion. And as I read through them, I felt something settle even further, not anger, not resentment, but certainty, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be real. I closed the folder gently and placed it back in the drawer, not hiding it, not locking it away, just returning it to its place with the knowledge that I now understood its importance in a way I had not before. And as I stood there in the quiet of the hallway, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided in a moment of emotion or confrontation, but through careful, deliberate steps that no one else needed to see coming until it was already too late to question. By mid-morning, the house felt lighter, not because anything had changed on the outside, but because I had stopped waiting for it to feel like it used to, and that small shift made every movement more deliberate, more mine, as I moved through the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean, straightening items that did not need adjusting, not out of habit this time, but to give my thoughts a steady rhythm as they settled into something clearer. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed softly on the counter, the sound breaking the quiet in a way that felt almost intrusive, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw Daniel's name, the message short and predictable, asking if I had made it home okay last night, as if the evening had been something ordinary, something that required nothing more than a polite follow-up, and I read it once, then again, noticing not what it said, but what it did not say. No acknowledgement, no reflection, no awareness of the moment that had shifted everything, just a surface-level check that allowed him to move on without looking back. I placed the phone face down without replying, not out of anger, but because I understood that answering right away would pull me back into the same pattern of smoothing things over, of making it easier for him to remain comfortable. And for the first time, I was not interested in making things easier for anyone but myself. The silence returned, steady and unbroken, and I stepped outside onto the back porch, the cool air brushing against my skin, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and distant leaves, the yard stretching out in front of me exactly as I had maintained it, trimmed, orderly, cared for. And I stood there for a moment, looking at it not as something I had built for others to enjoy, but as something that existed regardless of who appreciated it. The gate at the side of the yard creaked slightly, and a small voice called out, soft and uncertain, and when I turned, I saw Emily standing there, her backpack still on, her hands gripping the straps as if she was not sure she should be there at all, and I walked toward her slowly, opening the gate with a gentle motion, her eyes lifting to meet mine with a mixture of hesitation and something else, something that felt like concern far beyond her years. "Grandma," she said quietly, stepping inside, and I could see the way she glanced toward the house, as if making sure no one else was watching, and I crouched slightly to meet her at eye level, keeping my voice calm, steady, inviting her to speak without pressure. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, then leaned in just enough for her words to remain between us. "Mom said you always try too hard, and that dad feels bad for you." And the way she said it was not cruel, not mocking, just honest in the way children often are when they do not yet understand the weight of what they are repeating. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood, and I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, reassuring her without correcting her. Because this moment was not about changing her perception, it was about confirming mine, and as she looked up at me, waiting for a reaction she did not fully understand, I offered her a small smile, the kind that told her she had done nothing wrong, that she was still safe in my presence, even as something much larger shifted quietly into place behind. My calm expression. I straightened up slowly after Emily's words settled between us, not because they surprised me, but because hearing them spoken out loud removed any space left for doubt, and I guided her gently toward the porch steps, asking about her day in the same calm tone I had always used, letting her talk about school, about a spelling test, about a friend who forgot her lunch, small things that belonged to her world and did not carry the weight of the one I was quietly reassessing. And when she finished, I handed her a small cookie from the kitchen, something simple, something familiar, and watched as she smiled in that easy way children do when they feel safe, a reminder that not everything had shifted, not everything needed to. When she left, the gate closing softly behind her, I remained standing there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the railing, looking out over the yard that had once felt like an extension of the life I built for others, and now felt like something I could finally choose for myself. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that required immediate action, but in a way that allowed me to think clearly about what staying in this role would continue to cost me. I went back inside and walked to the hallway again, this time not hesitating as I opened the drawer, pulling out the same folder I had reviewed earlier, and instead of simply scanning it, I sat down and read each page carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad, dates, account numbers, ownership details, the kind of information that does not change based on anyone's opinion, the kind that holds its value regardless of how someone chooses to treat you. And as I wrote, I felt a quiet sense of control returning, not over them, but over myself, over the choices I would make moving forward. The afternoon passed without interruption, the clock ticking steadily on the wall, each hour marked not by what I had lost, but by what I was beginning to understand. And by the time the light outside began to soften into evening, I had made a decision that did not need to be spoken aloud to be real, a decision that would not be announced in anger or defended in conversation, but carried out in steps that no one else would notice until they were already set in motion. I placed the papers back into the folder, this time organizing them in a way that reflected not just preparation, but intention, and I closed the drawer with a gentle push, my hand resting on the surface for a moment longer than necessary, as if marking the place where something had shifted permanently. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt like something that held me in place. It felt like something I could move within freely, and as I turned off the lights one by one again, I realized that what had begun as a moment of humiliation had quietly become something else entirely, something far more important than a single evening at a table, because it had shown me exactly where I stood, and more importantly, where I no longer intended to remain. 3 days passed before I reached out, not because I needed time to calm down, but because I wanted every step to come from clarity rather than reaction. And when I finally sent the message, it was simple, inviting Daniel and Ashley over for dinner that Sunday. The same tone I had always used, the same quiet consistency they had come to expect from me. And his reply came quickly, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for things to return to normal without having to address anything at all. Sunday arrived with the same steady rhythm as any other, the house clean, the table set, the familiar dishes prepared with the same care I had always given. But this time there was no expectation behind it, no hope attached to how it would be received, only a calm awareness of what the evening was meant to be. When they walked in, Ashley's eyes moved across the room in that same assessing way, and Daniel offered a brief hug that felt practiced rather than genuine, and I greeted them both with a polite warmth that did not extend beyond what was necessary, guiding them to the table without hesitation, without filling the space with unnecessary conversation. Dinner began quietly, the same clink of silverware, the same routine movements, but the atmosphere felt different, not tense, just clear, as if something unspoken had shifted its place in the room. and I noticed how Ashley watched me more carefully this time, as if trying to read something that was no longer visible on the surface. I let the silence settle before I reached beside my chair and placed a folder gently on the table, the same one I had reviewed days before, and I opened it without looking at either of them, my hands steady, my movements unhurried, creating a pause that neither of them interrupted. I went through my documents this week. I said evenly, my voice calm, not raised, not defensive, just factual, and Daniel looked up immediately, confusion crossing his face, while Ashley's posture straightened slightly, her attention sharpening in a way that told me she already understood more than she would say. I turned one of the pages toward them, not pushing it across the table, just placing it where it could be seen if they chose to look, and continued in the same tone. This house, the property, the accounts, they have always been in my name, and they will remain that way. The words hung in the air, not dramatic, not forceful, but solid in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to something more unsettled, while Ashley's smile tightened just enough to reveal the calculation behind it. I did not wait for a response, did not invite a discussion, because this was not a negotiation, and I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on it for a brief moment before lifting my gaze to meet theirs for the first time that evening, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a steady clarity that required nothing more to be understood, and in that quiet exchange, I could see it. The moment they realized that whatever position they thought I held in this family was no longer one I was willing to accept. The silence that followed did not need to be filled, because everything that mattered had already been said, and I returned my attention to my plate, cutting a small piece of food and taking a bite as if this were simply another meal, as if nothing unusual had taken place. But I could feel the shift across the table, the subtle tension in the way Daniel held his fork, the way Ashley's eyes flickered briefly toward him before settling back on me with a new kind of caution that had not been there before. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice uncertain, searching for something to hold on to, something familiar that might restore the balance he had always relied on. But I did not look up right away. I allowed his words to sit there, unfinished, until he stopped trying to shape them into something that would soften what had already been made clear. When I finally met his gaze, I did so without hesitation, without apology, and without the quiet reassurance I had given him for most of his life. And in that moment, I saw the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that whatever version of me he had grown used to was no longer sitting across from him. Ashley shifted slightly in her seat, her posture still composed, but there was a tightness in her expression now, a calculation that had lost some of its certainty, and she offered a small smile, one that felt more measured than confident. "We just thought you might need help managing everything," she said carefully, her tone smooth, almost practiced, but I heard what she did not say, and I did not need to respond to it directly. I set my fork down gently, placing it parallel to the edge of the plate, a small, deliberate gesture that drew their attention without raising my voice, and I spoke in the same calm tone I had used all evening. "If I ever need help, I will ask for it." And I let the words stand on their own, without explanation, without justification, because they did not require either. The room fell quiet again, not uncomfortable this time, but settled, as if something that had been out of place had finally been returned to where it belonged, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, not in retreat, but in completion, knowing there was nothing more that needed to be added. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, conversation staying on the surface, polite, controlled, and when they stood to leave, the routine repeated itself, coats gathered, keys in hand, but the difference was clear, not in what was said, but in what was understood, and when Daniel paused at the door, looking at me as if he might say something more, I offered him a small nod, not dismissive, not inviting, just final in a way that left no room for confusion. The door closed behind them, the sound soft but definite, and I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet return once more, but this time it felt different, not like something left behind, but like something I had chosen, and I turned away from the door without looking back, moving through the house with a steady sense of direction, not because I needed to change everything at once, but because I finally understood that I no longer had to remain where I was not respected, and that understanding was enough to carry me forward without hesitation.